This event is brought to you through a collaboration between Drake University and Sciline. Sciline is a philanthropically funded free service for journalists based at the American Association for the Advancement of Science in Washington, D.C. Sciline connects reporters to scientists in order to promote more credible, accurate, research-based news stories.
Is there much pressure that is brought to bear on you to say one thing or another, or can you just do your job?
So far I can just do my job, maybe until tonight, but I don't feel any sort of pressure from above to speak a certain way.
Good, so let it rip. Justin, you're a state employee, and your boss, the governor, is very much into renewables, but not so much into believing that climate change has a human component to it. Does that affect in any way how you do your business?
No, I'm the weather archivist for the state. I don't feel impeded in my position.
The state obviously is taking climate change seriously. We have the Outer Banks, we have sea level rise, we have coastal flooding, huge hurricanes, it's undeniable. So being able to be a part of that was really exciting for me. Personally, this is the biggest problem of my generation and a bigger problem for the generation behind me, but also professionally asking some really tough questions and trying to come up with some solutions.
With the complete lack of leadership from Washington that we have right now and going in the opposite direction, does that put more pressure, more responsibility on the states, on the localities to do something, and is there evidence that that's happening? Go ahead.
Yeah, I think it does, and I think some of the best solutions are the local solutions because you know what's going on in your area, therefore you know the best way to solve it.
We have a crisis of leadership in Washington on climate change. Is that an opportunity in a sense to do something meaningful at the state level, and in particular North Carolina?
I mean, even when the federal government is moving, it's not our most nimble institution.
Good point.
And when you think about large social issues, it's the states that start flipping, and then we move as a country toward the direction of addressing the issue. And with greenhouse gas mitigation, absolutely, the states have a role to play here in showing leadership, standing up. California has certainly been out in the lead, but other states are trying as well. On the adaptation side of the house, preparing for the impacts of climate change or becoming a little bit more resilient, local and state solutions are absolutely the ones that are going to stick because it's the people in the communities who need to come to the table.
To explain the difference between weather and climate, and just because climate.
How do you explain it, by the way? What do you say?
So I say, depending on the audience, I'll say weather is your at-bat and climate is your batting average. Weather is your mood, climate's your personality.
I've heard that one. That's a good one.
Yeah.
All right, go ahead.
So you use that as a tool, as kind of your gateway to talk to folks about climate change, and so you start with.
So the flood is a gateway drug for climate, essentially, right?
Yes.
All right,
It's what grabs people's attention.
Whatever you need, right?
You know, we were talking earlier that I've met a climate denier, but I've never met a weather denier. It's real local impacts that you can't question. So for the flood, for example, we talk about the events leading up to it, the setup, which is a big factor in the flood that did happen. It wasn't just the storm, it was what happened leading up to that. So you talk about how springs have gotten wetter overall, how that's going to continue in a warmer world, and so that's kind of your tie into climate change.
Attribution science, which is seeing the fingerprints of climate change on events, has really moved along in the past few years. And just last week, our colleagues put out a paper on the European heat wave and saying climate change absolutely made this more likely. I think back to 10 years ago when a reporter would call up and we'd say, well, we can't tie just one event to climate change. I think we're past that point, and we're seeing these heat waves, these droughts, these big fires out west where I came from, and saying climate change is here and it's in our face.
It's a big mental health issue with farmers in the Midwest. Given the variability that we've seen in conditions just going from last year to this year, D1, D3 drought in southeastern Iowa. Now we're moving into dryness, but in between we had record wetness. So farmers, they call, and yes, I do a lot of event planning, but they want some reassurance that, hell, my crop's going to come out all right, or they just need somebody to talk to. And that's, it weighs on you, but you're there as a service. You're there trying to make things better with giving them the proper information.
People want to know, how will it impact me? What can I do about it?
That's a long phone call. When you get a question like that, right?
Yeah, it's not a simple answer,
Yeah.
and climate impacts, they're very intricate, and there's a lot of interconnections.
I think back, I'm not that old, but I was in elementary school at the time where it was give a hoot, don't pollute, and we were taught about recycling, and we were taught about being good stewards of the earth. But that wasn't enough, and we're seeing this youth uprising now, which I think is very encouraging, and they absolutely have a right to be completely pissed off about the earth that we've left them. And they're the most effective communicators because they're the ones who have to deal with the problem that we caused. Yeah, I mean, passing the buck has never worked, and it didn't work for my generation, and it's not going to work for passing it to them. And we're all in this together. I hope to have a few more decades on this planet, and I have to wake up every day and feel optimistic about going to work and being a good steward of the planet for the people of North Carolina and also for my friends and family. This is certainly an issue of concern in North Carolina, and we saw this with Hurricane Florence, where you have these storms that are pushing the ocean water up these really large river systems, and then you have water coming down the rivers. We had a really wet year last year. And what you get is this compound flooding. And this is really the intersection of risk and vulnerability, because you have these low-income communities in some of these areas that just get devastated. And when you start to think about groundwater in some of these coastal ecosystems, saltwater intrusion is a big concern. So yes, the ice will play into the whole sea level rise problem, and it certainly has local impacts for people in North Carolina. I don't know if it'll make it all the way to Iowa, but
What about
But there are examples where we underestimated the trend, and Arctic sea ice is a great example of that. That's been retreating, melting at a faster rate than what the models did predict, and so but that tells us something. It says we don't get the physics quite right. We're not understanding something in the model, so we can learn from that and improve on that. Yeah, I mean, I think it is something that we think about. Some people say, well, what if you're wrong about climate change? What if it's not happening? And I say, well, what if we're wrong in the other direction? That it's going to be much worse than what we think.
Exactly.
And with models, you'll get kind of you'll run an ensemble and you'll get like a spread. So you'll get kind of a high and low scenario, and you can kind of take the average, and that's your best guess. But all we're doing is kind of giving people this cone to work with, and that's as best as we can do at the moment. But we hope to constantly improve.
you can take climate models and you can run them without greenhouse gases, without the human forcing, and see if it'll reproduce these events. And that's something that we're seeing show up in the literature, and this has been reported in the media for the past few years as well. So we're able to do that. We're able to play devil's advocate, and we're able to look at these events and say, yes, climate change made these more likely.
We are seeing more invasive species move further poleward or further north because of the warming nature of the mid-latitudes and the high latitudes. And so we see the Japanese beetles, we see the stink bugs. Our projections are showing that, yes, more invasive species are moving into agricultural parts of the United States and across the United States.
And I think from the public health angle, especially in the Southeast, this is a huge concern with some of these insect-borne disease vectors showing up in major Southeast cities. And I just moved to North Carolina, and it has been mosquito week for me.
We risk to heat waves and heat events, and not even necessarily high temperatures, but high minimum temperatures. So your nighttime lows are not getting down. We're not able to cool off, whether that's humans or animals, say for cattle production. So heat events would be one thing, flood, and then water quality impacts that come with that, vector-borne diseases and insects and mosquitoes and those kinds of things as well.
It's kind of grim pretty quickly.
We can take a leadership role in reducing our greenhouse gas emissions as a country and as states. When you look at the countries that are most affected by climate change, they're the ones who aren't contributing as much to the problem. We certainly are. So when we start pitching into this huge problem that we created, I think we absolutely have the moral obligation to do that. Yes, all of us not driving today isn't going to change anything in Russia. But small change leads to big change, and we need big systemic change. What can you do about it? Vote. And I'm not just talking about the candidates who will flood you in 2 days when the fair starts, but local elections really, really matter. Your city council, your mayor, we overlook some of these. These people can really affect real change in the community.
Iowa's had tremendous coverage about the floods and the infrastructure damage. You mentioned the June 30th flood last year, 6,000 homes had damage. Never did I hear a weatherman who was covering all this talk about climate change. Why is that?
This is a pet peeve of mine. Go ahead, Martha, you want to try that a little bit? This is changing, by the way, I think a little bit. I can expand on this a little bit too, but go ahead.
Yeah, I think so. A few decades ago, on-camera meteorologists were not so accepting, I guess, of the science in general, and really not willing to talk about and kind of denying the science of climate change. But that I see that as shifting, and it's really not necessarily the weather person who's on camera, but it's the television station. What do they think is valuable to talk about? But in Nebraska, I certainly see that changing. I get a lot of media is one of our top 3 groups that we engage with. Agriculture and education are the other 2, but I see that as not such a huge issue in Nebraska, but it would be good if we could get more stories out there about climate change, and the local TV person is kind of the trusted source, and a lot of people tune in just for the weather, so it would be great if added on to that we're a little climate piece.
Yeah, I think for most people, their contact with anybody who might be considered a scientist or even close to it would probably be their local weather person. And for years, they had this opportunity, I think, to make those connections. It didn't. A lot of it was, frankly, there's a long story relating to John Coleman and the Weather Channel, which I could go on and on about. But the other thing is that when you got your meteorological degree, they didn't teach climate simultaneously. So there was kind of a fundamental misunderstanding, and they were applying weather principles that they learned to the climate, and thus there was a lot of confusion. I think that's changing. I know Penn State now, for example, is teaching climate along with meteorology. So, and I think also, going back to that generational component, I think the younger weather people are more likely to make those connections.
When you expect the big impact to hit the Florida coast, and specifically Mar-a-Lago?
By the way, it sits on limestone, which is a sieve. So there's really nothing to do for Mar-a-Lago, I will tell you that. All right, so go ahead.
But some of these solutions are not easy. Should people be living near the coastline in flood-prone areas in the middle of forests where it's going to be impossible to protect them? Should much of contemporary agriculture let the prairie come back? In other words, there's some very deep-seated economic interests that are going to have to change before this problem is addressed, and I'm just wondering, how are we going to get to that point?
Component of environmental justice here as well. The rich people could build the walls. What about the people at the other end, where the wall ends, who can't afford it? So why don't you all 3 take this one, because it's a big one. Go ahead, Martha.
It's a big one, yeah. So I think what we can provide is a local trusted source of information, both historical and projected. And so we can make it relevant and local and tangible to people, and provide the science-based evidence that they need to base their decisions off of. We can help foster relationships and start dialogue or continue dialogue, and kind of help bring people to the table. At least I see that as my role. And Kathy brought up a good point of implementation. Plans are great, but implementing them, getting people to have a vested interest in them, that's really difficult. And that's personally where I love to work with social scientists, because a lot of what we're talking about is behavior change. And I'm a climatologist. I'm not a social scientist. So, and that's what I say, to young people, if you're interested in this topic, get into social science and work with people like us, and to institute this behavior change, because that's the way that this is going to be solved.
Justin.
We like to build berms around things to mitigate flood impacts, but we're still building on floodplains, and that's something that climatologists can't answer.
So a lot of these people have generations of families who have lived in this certain town, in this house, and it's not as easy as saying, hey Joe, you can't live in New Orleans anymore. That's it. I think when we remove the human component from it, then we're not going to solve anything. But like you said, this is a huge problem. It's not easy. Nothing worth doing is easy. And I think that, to Miles's point earlier, that it is a bunch of very small problems that we can start to knock off to start to get at the bigger problem. But we have a huge task in front of us, and we really need everybody on board. And if it's having the tough conversations about buyouts and retreat, having them, but remembering that there is just a human component to that.
Many cities across the United States are working on or have adopted climate action plans. Des Moines is working on one, slow process, but is working on one. My question is, as a state employee, are you involved in recommending, encouraging our state politicians to create state climate action plans? Because we have to go beyond the city ones to the state level. And I just wondered of your influence there with mitigation and adaptation with climate action plans at the state level.
Good question. Justin, that's for you.
This has to be a multi-agency public-private partnership. One agency can't do it. Iowa did have a plan back in 2011, I believe, from the legislature, was mandated in the legislature, and then it expired. So there was a starting point in Iowa, and we've noticed that smaller cities, Des Moines, Iowa City, Iowa Flood Center, and our universities, they have the pieces there. Now, getting those pieces together is why we need a larger collaboration. Yes.
How bad do you think things have to get before those who actually make decisions wake up? And then the question is that beyond the tipping point? Do you think at that point that we really can still do it?
So the train hasn't left the station, and we in the climate community bicker about timelines, but every day that goes by is a chance for us to take action, and there really is no end. Things will get bad. Things are bad. India is unlivable at certain times of the year. What will it take for the people making decisions to wake up? New people in their place.
Well, what about if we got the fossil fuel industry out of the political realm here a little bit?
Yeah, and I think about when people point fingers, you flew here. Yes, absolutely, I flew here. I didn't drive. Holding certain groups accountable is going to be more effective than me and Martha saying, well, she drove and I flew, so she's better than me.
Well, Justin walked. Did you see Greta Thunberg? Did you see how she's going to be arriving in New York? Speaking of young people, what's your name, young man?
Jack Lilly.
Jack Lilly? How old are you, Jack?
10.
Okay, go ahead.
What would happen if we didn't change our current problem in time?
Hopefully that won't happen. See, it's really tough to, that's a great question. It's one that's difficult to answer, but coming from a 10-year-old, I mean, that's really hard to deny and to negate. So it's really tough to argue. So thank you for your question. I don't have a great answer for you. I mean, all I say is, the sooner we act, the better. Like Kathy said, every day that goes by, we're losing our chance.
Is voting the only thing we can do? I mean, it's effective, but what could we all do tomorrow or next week? Or is it just not even worth it? We just wait for the election?
No, that's a great question. So you could work with the woman who's putting together the climate action plan for Des Moines. I would say get involved in your community, whatever effort is going on in terms of climate. And I think mobilizing others to do the same.
Serving as an informed citizen and kind of an agent of change. And I've heard kind of a famous climatologist say that the best thing we can do about climate change is talk about it and have dialogue and have meaningful communication and not just kind of battling each other, but talking about it in a real and local sense. Partnering with your local state climatologist or action plans that are going on, as Kathy mentioned. I think there's all kinds of ways that we can keep this conversation moving forward in a good direction.
Matt Russell, I lead Iowa Interfaith Power and Light. We're talking with farmers, connecting with the presidential candidates and other elected leaders. And in the last 10 days, 2 weeks, I've engaged with probably half a dozen media folks. And the first question is, how can we talk to people about the climate, the extreme weather that's happening, and is that changing people's minds? And that is such a last year question, because that assumes that we have to convince people that it's happening. And they say, oh, we have to, who can we talk to farmers? Is extreme weather changing their minds? Well, nobody's creating the space for farmers to actually talk about it. So how do we not just try to convince people, recognize that people have moved faster because of the youth, have moved faster than the media thinks, the politicians think. How do we create the space so that we can just this has been such a pregnant conversation tonight, like nobody wants to talk, and I understand why we can't, but we have to get past that.
Good. And you want to amplify that at all?
I think that gets to my point that science is a piece of this. So people will say to us, well, why aren't things happening faster? Why aren't you doing enough? We're a piece of it. We need to recognize that and bring these people into the conversation. Can we create platforms for the people who need to be there the most? And this is something that I grapple with. The people who are most affected by climate change are rarely at the table for these conversations. So making sure that at least I recognize that and can bring it up. But I'm not a community organizer, and there are people who are much more skilled in that than I am. So working with those folks, I think, would be more productive.
We're not going as quickly as what I think we need to and what would be good, but I stay hopeful.
It's hard not to, at some times, be sorrowful and crestfallen about where we are. But again, we have solutions. We have groups across the state. We have groups across the United States that want to do something. And I do think we have solutions.
Yeah, I am optimistic. I am a few other things. I'm angry. That we've known about this problem and we haven't solved it. And I grapple with these places that I've called home. I grew up in New York. I lived in Oregon for a decade. These are both very special places to me. I hope North Carolina will also become special, but I want people to experience the places that I did, the magic of Oregon, being up in the mountains without a huge wildfire breaking out. But also just we have to do this. This is hurting people in a real way, and it's not going to hurt rich people. It's hurting people in low-lying countries that just don't have the power to deal with what's happening to them. And that weighs on me. It certainly, it's difficult at times, and I've had to learn how to unplug sometimes just to save my energy and a little bit of my sanity.
So have people been watching who hasn't been watching the Apollo 50 stuff? 50 years since the Apollo 11 moon landing. And it's just a reminder of what this great country can do when it sets its mind to something. Or think about the mobilization during World War II and how, suddenly Ford plants that were, knocking out cars were spitting out bombers just as quickly. We could do this, and frankly, I don't think there's a single thing that needs to be invented. The technology is all on the shelf. It's just a matter of political will and some economic incentives, and those are obviously go hand in hand. But I'm so impressed with this audience. Thank you so much for your great questions. I have no idea how such smart people came up with deep fried butter. Was that just like a bad day you had? Thank you for your great questions, and thank you to our panelists. I think they did a great job. Martha Schulsky, Justin